Yo, what's up, my distilling villains? This is Boo from Mile High Distilling. Welcome to the newest installment of the Distilling 101 series. This is meant to be your end-all be-all Bible for distilling, kind of teaching you the ins and outs, obviously geared mostly towards intro people into the craft, but hey, stick around. You might learn something new if you're an adept distiller. And we've covered fermentation, we've covered distilling in this part of the series. I'll be honest, we probably should have started with this one we're going to talk about today. That's going to be recipe creation. Fermentation is technically where we start the craft, which is why the series started like that, but we have to create that recipe before we even ferment it, right? So let's go over the ins and outs of recipe creation. We're going to first start by talking about different bases, different recipe bases that we're going to be using for our spirits. Next, we're going to talk about different ratios and quantities we should be using to create those bases. We're going to dive just a little bit in between into some different resources and different things that I've found over the years and have been shared with over the years to kind of keep you going on that front of things. And what will likely end up being part 2 of the video in a future upload, we're going to be talking about different tips and tricks to get you started and keeping that consistency alive in your recipe, as well as just other things that can be helpful for developing that recipe. Then we're going to finish everything off with what I call final touches, things like dilution, blending, different things that we can do post distillation to sort of change up our recipe and make it unique, make it our own. So really that's what it comes down to being. If you take pride in what you're doing in this craft like I do, you're not just looking to make any whiskey. You want your whiskey. You want your brandy. You want to take a turn on there, use different ingredients that no one else is doing, do a little bit something post-distillation that you haven't seen before, and really making it something that you and everyone around you loves. So this is a great place to start. The first thing we need to go ahead and talk about is our recipe bases. We all know the basics of this. We know whiskeys are made out of grains. We know brandies are made out of fruit. But some people don't fully understand how far you can take this. Let's dive a little bit deeper. Let's start with whiskey. Yes, whiskey's made out of grains. Do you guys have any clue how many grains there are? And you can use all of them, a combination of them, for your recipe. A little later on in the resources section of this series, we'll be talking about grain bills, and there's a website that I have that tells you how to mimic certain types of whiskey. That's definitely something you can follow, but we also can fully follow our own path when it comes to that. For example, rye whiskeys have to be at least 51% rye in the grain bill to be considered a rye whiskey. That leaves 49% really up to you, and people take that a lot of different ways. We can use that majorly in corn. We can do some corn and some barley. We can add a specialty grain like maybe an applewood smoked malt to create an applewood smoked rye. You see where I'm going with this? You can really have fun. So just remember, whiskeys, yes, to create that recipe, we need some type of grain, but our ratios are really up to us. What I'd recommend for recipe bases as far as whiskey goes is you find out the type of whiskey you're looking to make. Maybe it's a bourbon. From there, Google something like, what is bourbon made of? Something to that effect. There's a few different ways you can phrase it, but basically you're trying to find out what ratios of grains you need to consider your product a bourbon. Same with rye whiskey, wheat whiskey. You guys get the drift. I would start there. And then remember, if you really want to create your own thing, have fun with it. We have so many different malts we can choose from. We have chocolate malts, honey malts, biscuit malts, all different things, lots of specialty smoked malts that can really change our flavors, sometimes for the worse and sometimes for the better. That's part of what recipe creation is about, is playing with those things, not being afraid to maybe suck at a batch. Maybe it doesn't come out good. You can always proceed from there. On top of this, there's also something known as a whiskey sour mash. And essentially what that is we will distill a batch of our whiskey, and then we take the spent wash, the leftover remnants of our boiler, pump it into a fermenter, pitch a few new fresh grains, and then pitch yeast over that and create like an offspring of that batch. That's not really something everyone does. It's an acquired taste, but when you're talking about recipes, never really be afraid to start working with those sours as like an offspring, an offshoot of your original recipe, and see what that does for flavor. Our next recipe base is vodka. Vodka is definitely a very versatile one. I can almost guarantee your favorite vodka you buy from the liquor store is made through something known as GNS. That stands for grain neutral spirit. What a distillery does is they will ship this already pre-distilled at 190 proof spirit, completely neutral, get it shipped to them, throw it in their still, redistill it, and call it their own vodka. A lot of those premium vodkas, that's all they are. Some people consider it cheating. You can buy it for pennies on the dollar as opposed to regular ingredients. And if we want to not cheat and be an artisan, we can also use really any fermentable sugar. Vodka is very versatile like that. There are vodkas out there made through grains such as wheat or millet. And then there's also just neutral sugar-based vodkas. Those are very popular. We're talking about cane sugar, we're talking about beet sugar, we're talking about molasses, dark brown sugar, basically. So for our vodka base, this is definitely a cheaper one and an easier one to start with. Our recipe base for our vodka doesn't have entirely as much effect as, say, a whiskey would. Those whiskey grains are definitely going to come over, and it's important what you're choosing for your grain bill. For your vodka, we're distilling it at such a high proof, and it's meant to be as neutral as possible, so our bases are somewhat irrelevant. We'll talk more about recipe creation for vodkas and sort of making them our own later on in different sections throughout this video, but just understand that vodka, like gin, which we'll talk about next, is really versatile. So on to gin. Gin, again, is extremely versatile. We can make it out of wheat, millet, other types of grains. We can also make it out of any neutral sugar. Most of gin and its recipe creation comes from infusion and the botanicals we choose to put inside that gin. So with that said, I choose to make my gin base as neutral as possible. I usually get that best through sugar. That is cheaper than grains would be. It's less work compared to what grains would be, and it produces that completely neutral characteristic so that my botanicals can take over. We will talk about infusions in a later portion of this video, but gins are going to be in the same category as vodka, to where your recipe base is really up to you. I would try to go neutral. Rums, to be done traditionally, use molasses. We can go crazier than that. We can actually ferment a bunch of rotting goat heads and different carcasses and create what's called a dunder. That is a type of rum. I'm going to just give you all the benefit of the doubt and say you probably don't have a bunch of rotting carcasses ready to ferment, so probably stick with the molasses, okay? But, I mean, if you have them, I don't know why you do, go ahead and use them and create a rum that way. There's also a variant of dunder, which can be made through a sour rum mash. So the same thing we're doing with that sour whiskey, we're distilling that rum out, and then what's left over in the tank, we're putting that into a fermenter, maybe adding some fresh molasses or something to that effect, pitching more yeast, and off goes our second batch. As far as the molasses goes, try to use something premium. That's our general rule of thumb. We always want the highest grade ingredients we can get. Our tequila base is going to be in the same strain of things. Really, I don't think there's a tequila on the market that's not made through agave. There's also mezcal, which is kind of a different type of tequila, and again, as far as I know it, they're kind of all made from agave. So if you're trying to create that tequila base, you have one thing you can go with pretty much. If you want to keep it traditional, that is agave. We've done sort of a strange recipe for a tequila called our honey tequila, where we did agave, but plus a little bit of honey, and then we had some honey malt in there, and we just wanted to see what happened. It turned out fine, pretty much just tasted like tequila. But again, that just goes to show you can really have fun with the recipe you're creating and create something different. And of course we have brandy as well, which again, you're kind of stuck on one base. All brandies traditionally are made from is fruit. They're basically just distilled wine. What's fun about brandies is that there's so many different fruits out there and people can get really wild. I mean, we can think outside the box on this. Think of all the crazy strains of fruit they have that most people don't know about. Not super crazy rare, but like even pomelos or something most people wouldn't think of, you can turn that into a brandy. So you can have a lot of fun with fruit. It can really change your flavor. Some carry over extremely well, some don't carry over at all. But, you know, again, this is recipe creation. Our next topic we need to discuss here is ratios. How do we know how many pounds of grains do we need for our recipe? How do we know how many pounds of sugar we need for our sugar wash? Well, hopefully this will get you on the right track. Keep in mind here, something very important is there are a lot of variables when it comes to things like this in distilling. So I'm going to give you some base numbers, and I'm going to sort of help you understand, because I'm going to give you a spectrum here where I'm getting these two numbers from. Like, for example, you know, 2 to 3 pounds of this or that. I'm going to explain why it could be 2 or it could be 3, and take it all, please, with a grain of salt, because even though these numbers are accurate, and I believe they'll get you started successfully through that batch following these numbers, you have to keep in mind there are many different variables. For example, one of those variables is going to be our ABV. This isn't designed to get you like incredibly high ABV all the time. These numbers are designed to just get you like a respectable number of maybe like 12 to 15% alcohol by volume. Anything crazier, then you might have to up that quantity. Anything lower, you might have to lower that. Other variables include like different yeast strains are going to kind of change the amount of sugar that they need to like feed on. So different things like that. What this is designed to do is get you started in the right direction. As I mentioned, also keep in mind that these numbers are designed to carry you from anywhere from a 1 gallon still to a 1,000 gallon still. We're going by pound here, and for the most part, that should carry over. You should be able to scale that pretty effectively throughout any size still. So let's start with the loaded one here. Let's start with grains. How do we know the ratio of grains to use? Well, the best number I can give you there, that's going to give you decent results, respectable ABVs. That's going to be about 2 to 3 pounds of grains per gallon of liquid. I would say the 2 pound worth is more for people who are looking to save a little money on grains and then make up their gravity through like a fermentable, highly fermentable sugar like dextrose or something. So you usually have to add sugar onto those grain batches using 2 pounds worth. 3 pounds are going to give us a little bit more of that higher ABV without having to add sugar. There is certain occasions, depending on the efficiency of the grains, that you may have to add sugar to get to a higher ABV. This is the recipe making video, so just really quickly, we'll talk about efficiency, just so you guys understand what I'm saying there. Efficiency is the efficiency of the grains. The more you stir the grains, you'll get more sugars, and the more sugars you get, the higher the efficiency you get, the higher ABV you get. So as you're cooking grains and you're not really paying attention and you're stirring every hour or so, you probably have lower efficiency than someone who would be consistently stirring. Those people who are consistently stirring may get an extra 2 to 3% ABV out of their fermentation than the people who don't. So that's what I'm talking about with variables. I personally do not like to use any sugar if possible in my grain fermentations, just personal preference, but not everyone is me, and you guys are free to do what you want. For sugar washes, which is a very common, simple recipe that some people like to play with, you don't really have a whole lot of leeway unless you wanted to try doing some interesting things in your fermentation to incorporate more flavor out of that sugar. But we're here just to talk about sugar ratios. Without any additives, let's say we don't add anything but sugar, we're just creating a neutral spirit, then our ratios would be what I would call around 1.5 to 2 pounds of sugar per gallon if you're using like a regular distiller's yeast. What's really popular with sugar washes is people using turbo yeast because it's very high yield, and if they're making something neutral anyway, they don't really care as much about the off flavors that may present themselves with turbo. So if you're using a turbo yeast, that needs a lot more sugar to thrive properly, and so I'd recommend 2 to 3 pounds of sugar per gallon. For fruits, our numbers change consistently. Any type of fruit we use, we're going to have a little bit of different numbers. There are fruits that are higher in water content than other fruits, higher in sugar content or lower in sugar content than other fruits, and so our numbers constantly change. There are fruits that are bonded by starch and we have to convert them into sugars. There is a lot of different variables when it comes to fruit, so I really don't have a solid way to get you a solid number, unfortunately. What I do have in the resources section of this guide that we'll be going through next, we will have a fruit making chart which has a bunch of really awesome common fruits that we can use,
and that's a good base to get you started. What I'd recommend is if you're trying to basically create that recipe from a fruit that's not on that list and you can't seem to find a recipe, my base number I'd give you, and again, this is so broad, I apologize, I can't be more accurate for y'all. I would start with probably around 3 to 4 pounds of that fruit per gallon. That's a really base number. This is a good lesson in remembering to just have fun and play around when you're creating your recipe. Unfortunately, because of the way this craft is, and given that it's a little bit hush-hush, you're not always going to be able to find the information you need. And so as a home distiller, when you're taking it as a hobby level and you're making it fun, make it fun. Don't be afraid to try and play around with a recipe that no one has done, or at least that you can't find online, and just mess around with your numbers. Use certain amounts of fruit, maybe start small, see what gravity you get, and then decide if you need to pump it up from there. You know, that's really the name of the game. Let's also talk about high viscosity washes. What I mean by this is molasses, I mean agave, I mean honey, things like that that are really thick. As far as quantities go for this one is a little bit harder for me. I've worked with honey before, I've worked with agave, and I've worked with molasses, and my general rule of thumb is I use about 1 to 1.5 gallons per 5 gallons of fermentation. Obviously, you can break that down further. That comes out to like right below a quart per gallon on the lower end. But yeah, more or less, this one's a little hard. Most recipes will incorporate about a gallon per every 5 gallons of water. I find, and I've heard other people find, that 1.5 gallons is a little bit better of that ratio, carries over a little bit more, ferments and gets a little higher ABV. Generally, that's what I do. 1.5 gallons would be my recommendation, but you end up doing your thing. You try it both ways and see what works for you. More so with honey washes, I've seen that a lot of the time they don't produce enough oxygen to fully ferment, so be sure to pump that fermentation full of oxygen. You can use different ingredients to do that, or give it a nice, really nice stir or a starter to kind of keep it going. Remember that you can also get pretty creative when it comes to these high viscosity mashes. With agave, I've used honey with agave just to see what happens. And with honey washes, I'd recommend you could even put like a honey malt, crushed up honey malt into your honey wash. You could look at fresh honeycomb if you have access to that and ferment on that as well. As far as botanicals go, this is a very hard ratio to give you. The problem with it is some botanicals are going to be treated differently than others, obviously. There are certain botanicals that whether you have an 8-gallon still or an 80-gallon still, you're going to use the same amount of that botanical for your recipe. There are other botanicals that don't carry over quite as well, and you will have to extraordinarily increase your volume worth of that botanical to get the right blend. This one is, unfortunately, it breaks my heart to say it, it's going to be trial and error, and I really don't see a way around that. If any of you guys are gin making experts and want to kind of comment down below on things you found out, from what I see and what I've known from gin and what I've heard from gin, unfortunately, there is no tried and true recipe. If you're trying to create your own gin, at least, you can definitely find a Tom Collins recipe or some other type of Bombay dry gin, maybe, recipe online. They are out there. And if that's all you're going for, then you're not going to have a problem. If you're trying to create your own gin, it's really just trial and error. I would recommend starting small. I would recommend not introducing too many botanicals. Keep it simple at first. And then, maybe you notice when you distill that batch that it needs a little more spice. Well, now you can add 1 more ounce worth of coriander seed, something to that effect. I know when people think gin, all they think is like pine forest, juniper, pine sol. There are so many gins in craft distilling that are unique, and it really is worth it to play around with those botanicals and find out an amazing blend of botanicals. I've had pepper forward gins that just blew my mind, and it just goes about being creative. I think that used like 7 or 8 different botanicals, and then its main kicker was like hatch chilies. I do believe it took around 6 months or so to actually get that recipe created though. So again, time, patience, trial and error.
That is my recommendation for gin. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. We're finally going to be talking about resources that I've been teasing you guys with this whole video. Before that, one more thing, guys. It's shot time, man. That gin I was just talking about, that's what this is. This is the culminated effort of many months worth of gin botanical blending, and I'm going to taste its final product, the fruits of the labor. If you guys have a shot near you, if not, please go grab one. Let's take a shot. This is a toast to you guys, learning your craft, getting that recipe down. I have good hopes for you, okay? Take a shot with me, guys. Thank you for watching as well. Citrus, pepper, and root, like licorice root. Very, very good stuff. Also, just because I haven't said it before, if you are enjoying this video, please be sure to like it. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel. We have more of these coming, as well as many more distilling videos in general. Now, I promise you guys, no more teasing. Here we go with some resources. Our first resource is going to be about grain bills. So I have a few here. I have a few suggestions for y'all. The first one is probably my favorite. It is extremely comprehensive. I've included a link to the page in this video, as well as down below an actual hot link you can click. Go show the creator some love here. This was an extremely well put together list. Now that we understand more about our ratios, we can take these percentages, we can find our favorite whiskey that's on this list, and then copy that using our ratios. There are a few more that we can glimpse over here. There are links to those found down below as well. Please go show the original creators some love for all the hard work they've put into these. If you guys have any more info that you'd like on mash bills or different recipes, ask me or just get creative. Do it yourself. You guys got this. I know you do, but I'm always here for you. You're also always free to type into Google mash bill cheat sheet or something to that effect, and there are many other pages like this. As far as fruit goes, really I don't have an extreme amount of resources, but the information I do have has been very helpful to me. I've used our fruit making chart. It's blurry here. I'll send you a copy if you guys email me. My email information is down below, but this chart has been really helpful for making fruits in the past. I've sent this to a lot of customers, and it's also been helpful to them. It's been a really great source and seemed to be pretty accurate in terms of the ones that I have tried following this. I do always really encourage people, since brandies and like anything with fruit, most people would be doing a wine with them, and wine is a legal craft. So there's a lot of useful information out there regarding that. Same with whiskeys and grains. But essentially, I mean, type in like the fruit you want to use, wine making recipe, or the grain you want to use, beer brewing recipe, and you'll usually find something, or at least maybe even a calculator or something to determine what you're wanting to figure out. So again, those are more readily available because they are in the legal craft area, and so you will hopefully find what you need. There are a good number of calculators out there as well. There are beer brewing PPG calculators. There's different gravity calculators to kind of determine what your ABV would be with your amount of media volume that you're using. There's a few good resources there as well. So again, this is just kind of a glimpse what you're seeing. There are links to everything down below if you want to interact with these sites you're seeing. I'm just taking basic screenshots. Homedistiller.org is really probably one of the most ultimate sources of everything distilling, and it's such a high recommendation on my list always. They have an amazing forums page. You can find some really off-the-wall recipes, interact with home distillers just like you who are just really passionate in the craft. You can get questions answered. You can talk to people that are on a commercial level and like definitely are in the know. Obviously, like any big social place on the internet, you are going to have some misinformation. Take some things that are on here with grains of salt. But as far as recipe goes, I mean, these are generally people that know what they're talking about. They've done this recipe, they've worked through this recipe, and it's worked for them. Consider that for your recipe making needs. I believe there's also a category for recipes. I want to say that's true. I'll figure out when I edit this and probably include a screenshot to the recipe page if there is one. And then, as I mentioned before, home brew sites, wine making sites are really going to be your best friend here. The crafts are interchangeable, so even though we're probably only talking about grains and fruits, in those sites, and you probably won't be able to find like a tequila recipe within those sites. It's still really good info to have, and a lot of you guys are going to be making those whiskeys and are going to be making those brandies. So that's a very helpful tool to use. There's a lot more information shared because it's a legal craft. There's a lot of interesting recipes. People are generally more involved within that community because they're not as worried, I suppose. It's also probably just bigger in general. Guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm going to pour myself a second shot here. It's been a little bit of a hard week for me. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, if you enjoyed the video. If you're sticking around this long, feel free to take another shot with me. If not, I'll just take it alone, I guess. Bye, guys. We'll see you later. Okay, peace.